The desert sun beat relentlessly on the dry plains of Nevada as the small wagon creaked to a stop in front of a modest ranch house. Dust swirled like a veil between two fates, each on the verge of colliding. Amelia Hayes sat still, her dark eyes staring at the figure standing on the porch, a giant of a man whose shadow seemed to stretch across the land. 7 feet tall, muscular, with skin hardened by years of working the land, Mason Drake was a legend in these parts. Her father's voice, tight with nerves, sliced through the heavy silence. "I brought her, like we agreed. This is the one, Mason. My debt's paid, right?" Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. The weight of her father's words sunk in like a stone. He had sold his only daughter, to settle debts with a man who was notorious for being ruthless. The contract was sealed, and she had been offered up like cattle. Her father's voice trembled. "Mason, we had an agreement. I said I'd bring her here, and that would settle my debt. You said," Mason's voice cut through, low and dangerous, "your debt was $2,500, Hayes. This," he paused, his cold gray eyes scanning her like a predator eyeing prey, "barely covers half." Amelia's breath hitched as the giant cowboy descended the porch steps, his boots sending small tremors through the dry earth. His every movement was deliberate, calculated. He towered over her father, casting an intimidating shadow on the wagon. "You agreed, Hayes," Mason growled, eyes narrowing. "I didn't ask for your daughter. You said she could work off your debt. I'll take her, but only on my terms." Amelia's fingers tightened around the edge of the wagon as she willed herself not to cry out. Panic surged through her veins. She was alone, completely alone, with a stranger in the middle of nowhere, with no one to save her. And the man who now owned her could snap her father's neck without blinking. "Let me see her," Mason demanded, his eyes narrowing, locking onto her in a way that made her skin crawl. Her father stepped aside as Mason approached, every step like thunder on the parched earth. He was like a mountain coming to life, his presence massive and overwhelming. He stood in front of her, towering so far above her that Amelia had to tilt her head back just to meet his gaze. Amelia swallowed the bile rising in her throat but didn't back down. Despite the fear clawing at her insides, she held his stare, refusing to show weakness. Mason's piercing gaze swept over her, calculating, almost clinical, before he spoke again. "How old are you?" 21, she answered, her voice steadier than she felt. His lips curled slightly. "Can you cook?" "Yes, and I can clean, sew, tend to the animals, and do whatever else you need," Amelia replied, her words clipped, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. Mason paused, his cold eyes measuring her, and then without a word, he reached into his jacket and tossed a thick envelope toward her father. Her father snatched it out of the air, his hands shaking, eyes wide with fear. "Debt's paid," Mason said with finality, turning his back on her father, dismissing him as if he were nothing more than an afterthought. Her father, having received his payment, wasted no time. He jumped into the wagon, not even sparing Amelia a second glance. The reins cracked, and the wagon lurched forward, disappearing into the horizon as Amelia stood frozen in place, alone. The reality of her situation slammed into her like a brick wall. She had no family left, no home, and now she was bound to this stranger. Mason Drake had bought her, just like her father had promised. Her life no longer belonged to her. Mason's gruff voice broke through her thoughts. "Take your bag." Amelia turned to find him holding her small canvas satchel, the only possession she had left in the world. She took it from him without a word, their fingers briefly touching. His hand was massive and calloused, but his grip was gentle, surprising her. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice almost a whisper, unsure of how to act in this strange, terrifying moment. Mason gave a short grunt and turned toward the house. "Come on, girl, we've got things to discuss." She followed him across the yard, past a modest garden, to a well-built ranch house. Amelia expected to find squalor, a haphazard bachelor's den full of dust and disorder. But to her surprise, the interior was pristine, meticulously clean. Handcrafted furniture filled the rooms, each piece looking as if it had been made with love and care. A roaring fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the kitchen was surprisingly well stocked, with copper pots gleaming on the wall. Mason gestured to the large wooden table at the center of the room. "Sit." Amelia obeyed, her hands trembling as she set her bag down at her feet. Mason moved to the kitchen, returning with a jug of water and 2 tin cups. He poured water for both of them, the cool liquid a small comfort. Then He sat across from her, his eyes never leaving her face. For a long moment, Mason said nothing. His gaze was unyielding, like a storm on the horizon, threatening to break at any moment. Amelia forced herself to meet his gaze, keeping her fear locked inside. She had learned to survive by showing no weakness. Finally, Mason spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Your father is a coward and a fool," he said. "He came to me 3 weeks ago, begging for mercy. Said he had a daughter who could work off his debts. He thought it'd be simple, that I'd take you and forget about it." Amelia couldn't stop herself from speaking. "You should have thrown him out then." "I should have," Mason agreed, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. "But I was curious. What kind of man sells his own blood?" Amelia's stomach twisted at the words. "Now you know." Mason stared at her for a long moment, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. "I'll be honest with you, Amelia. I don't need a housekeeper. I don't need someone to cook or clean. But I need someone to keep this place running, and you need to survive." She met his gaze with renewed determination, her shoulders squared. "I'll work hard," she said firmly. "But I'm not your property." Mason raised an eyebrow, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're not cattle, but in the eyes of the law, your father signed papers that made you mine for the next 5 years. During that time, you'll earn your keep. You'll work the land, cook, clean, and do what I say. And in return, you'll have safety. You'll have food, a roof over your head." "Safety from what?" she asked, her voice sharp. "From your father," Mason replied. "From any man who thinks a woman alone is easy prey. From hunger and the elements. This land tries to kill people. Every day." Amelia couldn't look away as Mason leaned in slightly, his presence overpowering even across the table. "But understand this. Your father made you property when he signed that contract. There's no sheriff out here. There's no one to save you. This is your life now." Fear gripped her heart, but she refused to show it. "And what if I don't want it?" Mason's expression softened, just slightly. "Then you'll leave. You're free to go. But the land is vast, and you'll never make it alone. If you stay, you'll work hard, and I'll respect your boundaries. I won't force you to do anything. But if you make my life hard, we'll see how long my restraint lasts." Amelia stood silent, her mind racing. Was this the life she was now bound to? Alone with a man who could take anything he wanted and legally, no one could stop him? Mason's eyes darkened, and a flicker of something dangerous ignited within them. "I suggest you take a breath and think about your decision, Amelia. This is your reality now. Your father sold you, but I'm giving you the chance to survive. Take it or leave it." Amelia's mind spun with 1,000 thoughts, none of them good. She had no choice, it seemed. She was trapped in a world of broken promises, with only Mason Drake standing between her and certain death. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I'll stay." Mason nodded, as if he expected that answer. "Then we start tomorrow, at dawn. The chickens need feeding, the garden watered. We have a routine to follow. Get some rest. You'll need it." Amelia's gaze lingered on Mason as he turned away, his massive frame filling the doorway. She had no idea what her future held. But one thing was clear. She wasn't just a pawn in this man's game. She was determined to survive. And somehow, she would make him regret ever thinking he could own her. The early morning sun crept over the distant hills, casting a soft orange glow over the vast ranch. Amelia woke with the sound of a rooster crowing outside her window, the dry air seeping through the cracks in the walls. She lay still for a moment, unsure if the events of the previous day had been some kind of cruel dream, but the reality of her situation slammed into her as soon as she pushed herself up from the bed. Her father was gone. The ranch was empty, save for Mason Drake, the man who now owned her, in every way the law would allow. With a deep breath, she dressed quickly in a faded dress, gathering the courage she needed to face the life that had been thrust upon her. She moved to the small mirror on the dresser, straightening her hair, brushing it back from her face, and tying it into a practical braid. It wasn't much, but it was all she had left. As she descended the stairs, the smell of sizzling bacon and brewing coffee reached her, a stark contrast to the cold weight on her heart. Mason was already in the kitchen, his massive form filling the space, his sleeves rolled up, and a grim expression on his face. His dark eyes flickered briefly to her as she entered, but he didn't acknowledge her beyond that. "You're late," he said, not even looking at her as he flipped the sizzling bacon in the pan. "I wasn't told when to wake up," Amelia replied, her voice steady despite the nerves gnawing at her insides. His gaze locked onto hers for a moment, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place in his gray eyes. Ranchers wake with the sun. You'll remember that for tomorrow. Without waiting for a response, Mason placed a plate of food in front of her. Bacon, eggs, and a cup of coffee. Amelia stared at the food, her stomach tight with unease. It wasn't that she wasn't hungry, it was the quiet, unspoken understanding that the next few months, perhaps years, would be filled with this kind of routine. A life that no longer belonged to her. She ate mechanically, her mind racing. Mason worked in silence. His, every movement purposeful, efficient. When they finished breakfast, he led her outside. The sun was already climbing higher in the sky, and the heat was beginning to press down on them. The ranch stretched out before her endless fields, the house in the distance, and a cluster of barns and stables that smelled of earth, horses, and leather. This is your world now, Mason said, his voice low as he motioned to the vast expanse. You'll be here at dawn every day. The chickens need feeding, the garden needs tending. The house needs sweeping and laundry. Simple things, nothing fancy, and you'll do them without complaint. Amelia nodded, her heart heavy with dread. The days would stretch on like this, filled with work, with silence, and with Mason's presence always looming like a shadow. He was a man of few words, but his eyes said it all. She belonged to him now, not just in body, but in every sense of the word. As Mason led her through the chores, the hours dragged on. She watered the garden, tended to the chickens, and swept the house. There was no time for daydreams, no room for escape. She worked until the heat of the afternoon was almost unbearable, the sweat soaking her skin and making her clothes stick to her. But still, she pushed on. Every task she completed, every ounce of energy she expended, was one step closer to surviving this nightmare. Mason watched her from a distance, his arms crossed over his chest as he stood near the barn, keeping an eye on her without saying a word. At first, Amelia had been tempted to ask him questions to demand answers, to fight back, but she knew better. There was nothing she could say or do that would change her situation. She was here, and she had no choice but to endure. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Amelia was near the barn, her back aching from the labor, when she heard Mason's boots crunching on the dirt behind her. She turned to find him, standing there, his face unreadable, but the tension in his posture unmistakable. "You've done well today," he said, his voice gruff. "Get some rest. You'll start again tomorrow." She nodded, too exhausted to speak. She didn't trust herself to say anything anyway. Her throat felt tight, as if the words she wanted to say were stuck behind a wall of fear and confusion. Mason didn't leave immediately. He stood for a moment, his gaze lingering on her, and Amelia felt a strange shiver run through her spine. It wasn't a look of approval. It wasn't warmth, either. It was a look that made her feel like an object, like a thing under examination. She could see the hunger in his eyes, the unspoken understanding between them that neither could escape. He had bought her. She belonged to him now, in a way that was more than legal. It was physical, undeniable. But that didn't mean she had to make it easy on him. As Mason turned and walked away toward the house, Amelia stood frozen for a moment, her fists clenched at her sides. She could feel the weight of the contract hanging over her like an iron chain. She had no control over her circumstances, no ability to escape. But she would survive. She would endure. She had to. The next few days passed in much the same way. Every day was a repeat of the last morning chores, work in the fields, tending to the animals, and preparing meals for Mason. He had little to say, only instructing her when necessary and observing her quietly from the sidelines. Amelia did the work without complaint, though the silence between them seemed to grow thicker with each passing day. It wasn't that she didn't have moments where she wanted to scream or run. The overwhelming sense of isolation gnawed at her every second. But the more she worked, the more she realized something strange. She wasn't just surviving. She was learning. She was becoming more than the terrified girl who had stepped off the wagon. Her muscles ached, her hands grew calloused, and her body became stronger, more capable. Mason was right about one thing. There was nothing fancy about life on the ranch. It was raw, unrelenting, and often brutal. But in that rawness, Amelia found a strange kind of peace. There was no pretense, no artifice, just the work and the silence. On the fourth evening, after another long day of grueling work, Amelia found herself sitting alone on the porch of the house as the last light of day faded into night. She was exhausted, but there was something strangely calming about the quiet of the land. It was as if the entire world had fallen away, leaving her with only her thoughts and the steady hum of the ranch. Mason, she spoke, her voice breaking the silence, though she wasn't sure if he would even respond. He had been standing near the barn, as he always did, but at her words, he turned and began walking toward her. His heavy boots thudded against the dirt as he approached, and Amelia couldn't help but watch his broad shoulders, his strong, steady gait. Despite everything, she couldn't deny that he was a force of nature, someone who commanded attention without even trying. He had bought her, yes, but there was something about him that kept her on edge. "You wanted something?" Mason asked, his voice as neutral as ever. Amelia hesitated. She had no real reason to speak to him. In fact, it was safer to stay silent, to keep her distance. But something in her had shifted. She wasn't just a pawn anymore. She was a woman, a person. "I wanted to know why," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "Why did you buy me? Why not just keep the land and the cattle?" Mason's gaze flickered for a moment, but his expression remained as unreadable as ever. "Because I needed you." "For what?" Amelia pressed, her voice growing stronger, the weight of his silence pushing her to ask the questions that had been swirling in her mind. Mason stared at her for a long moment, his gray eyes unblinking. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "To survive." Amelia didn't understand, but she didn't press him further. The answer was vague, but it was the first time he had given her something beyond an order, beyond a task. She didn't know what Mason wanted from her, what he expected, or what the future would hold. But for the first time since she had arrived, she felt something stir within her, a small, fleeting glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this, not physically, but emotionally. As the days wore on, Amelia realized that Mason's cold demeanor didn't mean he was a monster. It meant he was alone, just as she was. And there, in the quiet emptiness of the desert, they were both stuck, each needing the other for something they couldn't name. The days continued to pass in a predictable rhythm, a monotony that stretched on endlessly. The sun would rise over the barren landscape, casting long shadows over the ranch, and Amelia would rise with it, the same as always. The work never stopped. The mornings were filled with tending to the garden, feeding the chickens, and sweeping the floors of the old house. By afternoon, the sun would beat down so hot that the air shimmered, and the work would slow to a crawl, but still, Amelia pushed forward. Mason kept to himself most days, working the land or overseeing the cattle with a quiet intensity. He didn't speak much unless it was to issue an order or correct her, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. He didn't try to force her into submission. He didn't touch her unless it was absolutely necessary, and even then, it was only a brief, impersonal contact. There was an unacknowledged agreement between them he would stay out of her space, and she would work diligently without protest. But in the quiet moments when their paths crossed, Amelia couldn't help but notice the way his eyes lingered on her. I didn't know whether it was hunger or something else entirely, but the weight of his gaze felt different now. It wasn't just a look of ownership. It was as if he were trying to understand her, trying to see the person behind the walls she had built. It had been nearly a month since she had been sold, and despite the rigid control she had maintained, Amelia could feel herself changing. The constant work had shaped her into someone stronger, someone more capable of surviving in a world where no one had cared about her for years. The land had toughened her, but it had also taught her something. She wasn't just a victim of her circumstances. She had the power to adapt, to push through the pain, and maybe even to find some measure of peace in the hard, unforgiving world she now inhabited. One evening, after a long day of labor, Amelia sat outside on the porch, the sun dipping below the horizon, turning the sky into a canvas of crimson and gold. She wiped the sweat from her brow and leaned back, resting her head against the wood. She could hear the distant sound of Mason working in the barn, the rhythmic pounding of hammer against wood as he repaired the fence. For the first time since she had arrived, Amelia found herself thinking of the life she'd left behind, the life that seemed like a dream now. Her father, broken and lost in his own addictions. Her mother, long dead, leaving Amelia to fend for herself from a young age. She had been raised to be tough, to keep her head down, and to never show weakness. But even with that training, even with her stubbornness and grit, she had never been prepared for what came next. Mason's voice broke her reverie. "You're still here!" Amelia turned to find him standing at the bottom of the porch steps, a tool belt slung low on his hips, his face smudged with dirt and sweat. He looked like a man who had spent every hour of his life building this place, this ranch, piece by piece. His presence was overwhelming, but it wasn't as oppressive as it had been at first. She had come to realize that Mason wasn't a tyrant. He was a man who had been shaped by the land, just as she had been. He wasn't asking for anything from her except her compliance with the work, and in return, she had a roof over her head, food in her stomach, and a kind of safety she hadn't known in years. It wasn't ideal, but it was enough for now. "I'm still here," she replied, a wry smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I guess I've got nowhere else to be." Mason's lips twitched, as if he were suppressing a smile of his own. He stepped onto the porch, towering over her as always, and leaned against the post, his eyes studying her with that calculating intensity that always left her feeling exposed. "You're better at this than I thought you'd be," he said quietly, his voice gruff but not unkind. Amelia arched an eyebrow. "Better at what?" "At surviving. At keeping yourself from falling apart." She looked down at her hands, the calluses from work hardening her skin, and then at her worn clothes. There was a strange sense of pride that swelled within her. She had been nothing more than a commodity, a pawn to pay off her father's debts. But she had turned that around. She had learned the land. She had learned what it took to survive. "I'm learning," she replied, her voice steady, though she couldn't hide the sense of satisfaction in her words. "And I'm surviving." Mason didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, the silence between them stretching longer than either of them expected. For a moment, the weight of everything, the contract, the unspoken rules of their arrangement, the uncertainty of the future hung heavily between them. Finally, Mason spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You're not like the others I've dealt with. You don't just do what you're told. You think for yourself." Amelia didn't look up at him, but she could feel the shift in the air around them. She had never expected kindness or sympathy from him, but his words were different from the usual detached commands he gave. There was something almost human in them. It made her wonder if he saw her as more than just a woman to do his bidding. But she wasn't foolish enough to entertain those thoughts for long. "I'm not a slave," she said firmly, meeting his gaze. "I'm not here to be broken." Mason nodded slowly, as if he were considering her words carefully. "You're right. You don't belong here like that. But you do belong here. You belong on this land, with this ranch, and you'll stay here, whether you like it or not." A flash of something sharp passed through his eyes, and Amelia felt her pulse quicken. There was an unspoken promise in his words, one that she couldn't quite understand, but one that filled her with both fear and curiosity. The silence between them stretched again, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't tense or oppressive. It was simply the quiet of two people who had come to an unspoken understanding. For the first time, Amelia wasn't sure if she feared Mason, or if she had come to see him in a different light. "Tomorrow we go into town," Mason said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was firm again, as if he had made up his mind. "Why?" Amelia asked, a little surprised. She had expected their lives to continue without any change, without anything that might disturb the fragile peace they had built. "Everyone knows you're here," Mason replied, his eyes narrowing. "It's time the rest of them understand who you are. You're not just a servant. You're mine, and I'm not hiding you anymore." Amelia's heart fluttered in her chest, and the weight of his words pressed down on her. "I'm yours?" she echoed, the words feeling strange on her tongue. Mason's lips curled slightly. "You've been mine from the find moment you stepped off that wagon." The drive into town was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wagon wheels on the rough dirt road. The small town of Dry Hollow was only a couple of hours away, but Amelia felt like she was heading to the gallows. People would know her there. They would gossip. They would judge her. She could already feel the stares, the whispers that would follow her every step. When they arrived, Mason helped her down from the wagon, his hand resting possessively on her waist as they walked through the dusty streets. She kept her eyes forward, not daring to look at anyone directly. The women who had once seemed so unapproachable now eyed her curiously. They had heard the rumors everyone had, the whispers about how Amelia Hayes had been sold to Mason Drake to settle her father's debts. But as they entered the small general store, Amelia saw something in the eyes of the women. They weren't judging her. They weren't whispering behind her back. Instead, they were sizing her up, as if she were some kind of puzzle to be solved. It wasn't friendly, but it wasn't hostile either. The shopkeeper, a thin man named Perkins, looked at them with wide eyes as they entered. "Mason," he said, nodding. "And Miss Hayes?" Mason corrected him. "Mrs. Drake." The words hit Amelia like a slap, but Mason didn't seem to care. He was leading the charge, making it clear that she was his now, regardless of the legal details. The townspeople would have to accept it, whether they liked it or not. After a quick stop at the store, Mason turned to her as they walked out into the town square. "This is your life now," he said quietly. "No turning back." Amelia's throat tightened, but she didn't respond. She had already made her choice, and now she would live with it. There was no escape. As they returned to the ranch later that day, Amelia felt different. The quiet whispers, the stares, the understanding from the townsfolk, all of it settled around her like a cloak. This was her reality. She could either fight it or accept it. And, for the first time, she realized she had already started to accept it. The next morning, when she woke to the sound of the rooster's call and the sunlight creeping through her window, Amelia didn't feel the same overwhelming dread. She knew her place now. She knew what was expected of her, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she was just surviving. She was living.